So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Cultural Studies, where we're looking at Bell Hooks' essay, Understanding Patriarchy. We already have had 3 lectures on it, and we'll just continue with this and hopefully wind it up in the next lectures to come. Now, the point where we stopped in the last lecture is where Hooks is talking quite clearly about a more collaborative approach between men and women in terms of understanding patriarchy and in terms of dismantling patriarchy. And in this particular session that we will begin with today, she talks about how the dismantling requires a lack of denial. So we can't live in denial of patriarchy. We can't think of patriarchy as something which doesn't exist, whereas actually it does all the time. We consume it all the time. So denial becomes the very key strategy to consolidate patriarchy. We deny the existence of patriarchy. And Hooks says that denial must be subverted first before we begin to subvert patriarchy as a principle. So that becomes a very important lesson, a very important tenet, if you will, for patriarchy. And Hooks is obviously very, very keen to look at patriarchy as a strategy that she wants to dismantle, that she wants to critique and understand, and that critique must be collaborative in its approach, as she very clearly points out. Okay, so this is what she says over here. It should be on the screen. The paragraph beginning with, clearly, we cannot dismantle a system as long as we engage in collective denial about its impact on our lives. So this is what I meant when I say that as long as the denial exists, as long as there's a collective denial of the impact of patriarchy in our lives, then we can't really dismantle the system, dismantle it as a strategy or as an institution. Patriarchy requires male dominance by any means necessary. Hence, it supports, promotes, and condones sexist violence. So it perfectly legitimizes sexist violence. We saw in the early lecture, how the big daddy, the big father of the family, assaulted or physically abused a female child, a little female child, for not conforming to the patriarchal principles. So that was a completely legitimized, lawful assault. No one intervened. People supported it more rationally later on. The mother went and told the girl that she deserved it. It's all for her good, because this is meant to teach her a lesson. This is meant to teach her to become a better human being, a better girl, a better woman in subsequent times. So it completely condones sexist violence. It legitimizes sexist violence. It requires male domination. It promotes and sanctions violence of the worst order. We hear the most about sexist violence in public discourses and about rape and abuse by domestic partners. But the most common forms of patriarchal violence are those that take place in the home, between patriarchal parents and children. So this is again Hooks trying to understand the formative phase of patriarchy, where parents who are indoctrinated by their own patriarchal principles attempt to indoctrinate the children in similar principles by telling them what to do, what not to do. And that, according to Hooks, is the greatest form of patriarchal violence. It's a psychologized violence. It's a violence which is in a form of indoctrination, which is obviously which is designed to create conforming subjects in children, etc. So that becomes very unsettling, very disturbing, very nefarious, and very subterranean, sinister kind of a violence, according to Hooks. It's the most common form of patriarchal violence. So she says we talk about, we hear about rape and abuse and all kinds of sexist violence in public discourses, but what happens in the formative phase in a domestic setting, in a familial setting, is what is the worst form of patriarchal violence. Okay. The point of such violence is usually to reinforce a dominator model. So in order to map out the dominator, so who is to be the dominator, who is the hegemonic person over here. So that dominator model needs to be consolidated through this act of violence, the psychological violence, which is often just an indoctrination, but it's still a form of violence, in which the authority figure is deemed ruler over those without power and given the right to maintain that rule through practices of subjugation, subordination, and submission. So 3 S's become very important in patriarchy: subjugation, subordination, and submission. So you need to subjugate, you need to subordinate, and then of course that will generate submission, surrender from the subject, who will become a complicit and a compliant subject, in complete conformity to the patriarchal principles. So patriarchy requires subjugation, requires subordination, because there's a hierarchy in patriarchy. There has to be a big daddy, there has to be a grand patriarch whose words are law, whose behavior, whose actions are the template for patriarchal behavior, for the poor for patriarchal behavior, and you must submit your free will, you must surrender your free will and agency to that kind of a template in order to become a more conforming subject. Okay, so keeping males and females from telling the truth about what happens to them in families is one way patriarchal culture is maintained. So silence becomes the other S over here. So you're silent. The men and women, you just don't allow them. You create a situation, you create a condition where men and women cannot tell about what happens to them, what happened to them when they're growing up, when they were indoctrinated into being good boys and good girls in complete conformity to patriarchal principles. You can't talk about it. You can't talk about the psychological terrorism. You can't talk about the psychological indoctrination, the psychological violence, and that silence becomes another strategy of patriarchy. You completely silence the subjects. The subject cannot speak over here. A great majority of individuals enforce an unspoken rule in the culture as a whole that demands we keep the secrets of patriarchy, thereby protecting the rule of the father. So the rule of the father must not be spoken about, because again, speaking about it, talking about it, might give it potentially a constructed quality, might reveal its constructed quality, whereas not talking about it, being completely silent about it, will just conform and consolidate its given quality, its grand quality as a grand narrative. So the rule of the father becomes grand narrative by default, and that grand narrative must be maintained through silence, right? It mustn't be talked about, because if it's talked about, then it becomes open for questioning. It becomes open for an analysis which might reveal, which might point out its constructed quality, and that becomes a problem potentially in patriarchal systems. Okay. This rule of silence is upheld when the culture refuses everyone easy access to the word, even to the word patriarchy. Most children do not learn what to call the system of institutionalized gender roles, so rarely do we name it in everyday speech. This silence promotes denial. And how can we organize to challenge and change a system that cannot be named? So this is a very important analysis that Hooks is offering. It's almost an epistemic analysis, where she says that the word patriarchy is so rarely used in these kinds of systems where cultures of domination, cultures of subordination, complete institutionalization of gender roles take place. So when this institutionalization takes place, we don't use the word patriarchy at all, because using the word patriarchy will give it a name, will give it a classification, will give it a point of address. Then we can address to that address and then start examining it as a construct. Now, it's not named, people don't know it's patriarchy, the word patriarchy isn't used, and that becomes part of the silence, which then informs the denial subsequently. So you can see there's a structural chain and operational layer. So there is silence, there's denial, there's subordination, there's hierarchization, there is psychologization, there is institutionalization, but all these are part of the same plan of patriarchy, the patriarchal plan, if you will. And it has organized very neatly, very cohesively, in order to silence any potential rebellion, any potential voices which might go against it. Okay, so this silence promotes denial. So denial becomes a very key strategy. Denial becomes, as we mentioned a little while ago, denial becomes a very instrumental way, a very effective way, a very effective instrument, if you will, to protect patriarchy, to protect patriarchal principles, protect patriarchal affiliations, and patriarchal proclivities. So those proclivities require denial. I mean, if you just keep saying that patriarchy is bad, we must question patriarchy, then it becomes difficult for patriarchy to promote its proclivities. But if we are silent about it, the silence informs the denial, and that denial consolidates patriarchy as grand narrative. Okay, and the whole point is even more micro, even more specific, as Hook says. So even the word patriarchy isn't used. So we don't even mention the word patriarchy. There's no mention of the word patriarchy when children suffer institutionalized violence, psychologized violence. The entire psychologization takes place through acts of violence which create and conform certain gender roles, but the word patriarchy is never used in those situations. Okay, so it is no accident that feminists began to use the word patriarchy to replace the more commonly used male chauvinism and sexism. These courageous voices wanted men and women to become more aware of the way patriarchy affects us all. So the word patriarchy become, it got some currency with feminism, because feminists realized that the word patriarchy is a key to all the problems. Patriarchy is a key to all the problems. So instead of using male chauvinism and sexism, which then locate the problem to males alone, or women alone, patriarchy becomes a more complex word, a more complex term, which reveals that this is something which affects men as well as women. It's not just about male chauvinism or about women suffering, it's about a combination of everything. And patriarchy becomes a combination. Patriarchy becomes this very collusive activity which affects and which has agents who are men as well as women. So in popular culture, the word itself was hardly used during the heyday of contemporary feminism. So it was hardly used, was hardly in currency during the heyday of feminism. Anti-male activists were no more eager than the sexist male counterparts to emphasize the system of patriarchy and the way it works. For to do so would have automatically exposed the notion that men were all powerful and women powerless, and that all men were oppressive and women always and only victims. So anti-male activists who are not feminists, and this is a very important distinction that Hooks makes, and a very important distinction for us to remember. Anti-male activists and feminists are different categories of people altogether. Anti-male activists often end up becoming just as bad as male chauvinists, sexist male counterparts, and they were equally eager not to use the word patriarchy, because that would reveal the error, the fallacy in looking at the entire problem as men having all power and women are completely powerless, men were being completely oppressive and women being always victims. And this kind of a binary would be discovered to be an error, would be discovered to be a fallacy in judgment. So anti-male activists as well as some sexist male counterparts, they were equally reluctant to use the word patriarchy. They were more happy to use other words like male chauvinism, woman suffering, etc., which kept the locations at bay, which kept the mappings intact, the binary intact. And that was a problem. That was an impediment, according to Hooks, in our understanding of patriarchy, because patriarchy requires, as she mentions a more collaborative approach, and this collaboration becomes very important and will not exist, will not take place unless we do away with this binary of male being oppressors and women being victims, only men being all powerful and women being all powerless. So that kind of binary needs to be done away with if we are to have a more collaborative approach to understanding patriarchy and the problems of patriarchy. Okay, so by placing the blame for the perpetuation of sexism solely on men, these women could maintain their own allegiance to patriarchy, their own lust for power. They marks their longing to be dominators by taking on the mantle of victimhood. And this is a brilliant analysis as Hooks offers it. And she says this mantle of victimhood, that becomes a grand narrative in its own right, where women consider themselves to be sole victims, and they talk about men as being oppressors only. And that kind of binary did a lot of disservice to critique of patriarchy, because that just replicated the lust for power. That just replicated the hierarchy that women believed in, and that kind of woman, that these anti-male activists who were not feminists, according to Bell Hooks, they did a lot of disservice, a lot of problems to this entire understanding of patriarchy. And how do they do it? They masked their longing to be dominators by taking the mantle of victimhood, right? So the mantle of victimhood, by masquerading as victims, they wanted to be the dominators. They wanted to be, they expressed their lust for power. So it all ends up being the same power game, and that hardly changes anything. That hardly alters anything in the long run, fundamentally speaking. So it just replicates the entire structure of patriarchy without changing the basic and fundamental coordinates. Like many visionary radical feminists, I challenged the misguided notion put forward by women who were simply fed up with male exploitation and oppression that men were the enemy. So again, if you're talking about men as being the enemy, then you're just restricting yourself to a binary. You're caught up in a binary. And the same problem as you saw when you read Homi Bhabha's other question, if we just look at power being only located in the colonizer, and the colonizer being pure victims, that just is a very insufficient and inelegant analysis of the power problem in a colonial condition. So likewise, if we just brand the men as the enemy and women as the victims, then that becomes a very blunt binary, which doesn't allow us to engage with patriarchy and the problems of patriarchy at a complex level. Okay. As early as 1984, I included a chapter with the title Men, Comrades in Struggle in my book Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, urging advocates of feminist politics to challenge any rhetoric which placed the sole blame for perpetuating patriarchy and male domination onto men. So as you can see, the very word comrade away, men, comrades in struggle, it looks for a more collaborative approach in feminism, which takes into account men, which includes men, it's more inclusive in quality, and doesn't exclude men as the enemy. So this very exclusionary quality of looking at men as the enemy, as the oppressor, that is something that Hooks wants to move away from very clearly and very coherently. Okay, and this is what she had said in that particular chapter, which was entitled Men, Comrades in Struggle, and this is the quotation that she offers in this essay. Separatist ideology encourages women to ignore the negative impact of sexism on male personhood. It stresses polarization between the sexes. According to Joy Justice, separatists believe that there are two basic perspectives on the issue of naming the victims of sexism. There is the perspective that men oppress women, and there is a perspective that people are people and we are hurt by rigid sex roles. Both perspectives accurately describe our predicament. Men do oppress women. People are hurt by rigid sexist role patterns. These two realities coexist. Male oppression of women cannot be excused by the recognition that there are ways men are hurt by rigid sexist roles. Feminist activists should acknowledge that hurt and work to change it. It exists. It does not erase or lessen male responsibility for supporting and perpetuating the power under patriarchy to exploit and oppress women in a manner far more grievous than a serious psychological stress and emotional pain caused by male conformity to rigid sexist role patterns. So this particular section is a very important sort of example of how male responsibility and male oppression, they're not mutually contradictory. So men can be aware of the responsibility as well as the oppression as patriarchal agents, and that becomes a more holistic and more complex approach of looking at patriarchy to see how men can be oppressors as well as being hurt by patriarchy, as well as being reluctant agents of patriarchy, as well as being damaged by patriarchy in their own ways. And this damage and this exploitation can go hand in hand, and that's a more complex understanding of patriarchy, rather than looking at patriarchy as male being oppressors and women being victims. So victimhood and oppression, they are more distributed phenomenon. They are more sort of complex phenomena, especially when it comes to understanding of patriarchy, as Hooks points out in this section. So throughout this essay, I stress that feminist advocates collude in the pain of men wounded by patriarchy when they falsely represent men as always and only powerful, as always and only gaining privileges from the blind obedience to patriarchy. So if we look at men as always and always only powerful, always and only privilege from the principles of patriarchy, then that obviously does a lot of disservice. It colludes in the patriarchal principles rather than deconstructing it. I emphasize the patriarchal ideology brainwashes men to believe that the domination of women is beneficial when it is not. So again, the brainwashing happens to men, actually more to men than to women, because they are taught to believe they're superiors. They're taught to believe they are actually helping women by oppressing them, by cutting down their privileges, by cutting down their agency. They're protecting women, and therein lies the brainwashing, they realize the indoctrination of patriarchy as a principle. And this is a quotation that Hooks is offering. Often feminist activists affirm this logic when we should be constantly naming these acts of expressions of perverted power relations, general lack of control of one's actions, emotional powerlessness, extreme irrationality, and in many cases, outright insanity. Passive male absorption of sexist ideology enables men to falsely interpret this disturbed behavior positively. As long as men are brainwashed to equate violent domination and abuse of women with privilege, they will have no understanding of the damage done to themselves or to others, and no motivation to change. So it is very important, Hooks states so here, to make men understand the extent that they are damaged, the extent to which they are bruised, the extent to which they are wounded by patriarchy. Because only if you understand it, can they offer any possibility of change. And that change can only come from understanding of patriarchy, how patriarchy consumes them into behaving like active agents, irrational agents, masquerading as rationality, masquerading as duty, masquerading as protection. So, at a structural level, we can find some similarity between this and Orwell's shooting an elephant, because in that essay too, the white man realizes that what he's doing is a construct, what he's doing is a hollow act, and that actually makes him superior. This acknowledgement of inferiority, this acknowledgement, this knowledge of inferiority, this understanding of inferiority paradoxically makes them superior, paradoxically makes them actually a more elevated, existentially more elevated as an individual. So likewise, Hooks is saying over here that the first step is to make men realize that this brainwashing that they have, which explains to them, which teaches them, which convinces them that this is for protection of women, this is for the benefit of women, and this is the right thing to do. This indoctrination is a false indoctrination. And once they have the knowledge of the falsity of this indoctrination, that will be the first step in dismantling patriarchy from the male perspective, which is equally important as the female perspective. And therein lies the more collaborative strategy of dismantling patriarchy that Hooks sets out to define and describe throughout this essay. So I stop here at this point. I will continue with this lecture, with this text in the following lectures. Thank you for your attention.